appreciation and share my appreciation with you being here. I'm going to keep my chat open, and I invite you all as we go along to share any of your thoughts or ideas or anything that you want to in the chat. But yeah, other than that, let's get rock and rolling. See how this goes. Democracy deficit disorder. So in 2023, Cynthia and I published a book, or had a book published by an organization called the Peter Lang International Academic Publishers. It's a fine book. It's a couple hundred pages, reads like a book would. That's all about the democracy deficit. I know that's deep, right? It's all about the democracy deficit disorder. Since then, I've been facilitating workshops and giving talks based on this. And today, this workshop is going to look like this. It's activity-based. So like I said, we're going to do activities. I'm going to ask you to type things into the chat, or since there's so few of us, we can even talk it out loud. So don't be afraid to hit that unmute button as we go. We're going to consider what democracy actually is and how it actually happens in K-12 schools today. The focus of my study is always around K-12 schools and what that looks like and means. Cynthia spent a career in higher education teaching teachers. So we have that higher education perspective as well as K-12. We're going to use dynamic thinking tools. I have some things that I'm going to share as we go along that you could take away with you and help expand your thinking, but we're going to use them as well. We're going to learn about progressive activities in schools today, examine democracy in schools beyond simple voting and mock elections. We're going to identify barriers to democracy deficit disorder, and we're going to highlight different ways to overcome obstacles. Now, that's a lot of bullet points for a little short amount of time, but we're going to go at it and see how this works. So to start us off, what I would love everybody to do, and I see, I'm going to mispronounce some names, and I hope you forgive me. I see Ralph and Jada and Vanessa and Simone and Leah. And what I would invite you to do is to jump into the chat and just drop for yourself, drop your definition of democracy. There's no wrong answer here. Just hop right in here. And how would you define democracy? In your own words, just drop your response right into the chat. Simone, I'm glad I got your name right. Shoo. And there's no wrong answers. So this isn't a test. You're not going to get graded. Cynthia didn't bring her gold stars for the day.
I did not.
Any definition you can think of, write it right into the chat there. Simone, I know your keyboard's working now. See, that was a test to make sure. Oh, there we go. First to answer. All right, there we go. Here's Leah. Here's Jada. Ralph, I hope you can get in there. Vanessa, hope you can get in there. Nicole, I know you're busy, but if you get in here, that's great. Thank you, Ralph. I appreciate your words. All right, I'm going to read these so that we can all hear them if you haven't read them so far. Simone says, I feel like democracy is freedom of speech, freedom to vote, whether that's in or out of the classroom, just freedom in general. Leah says, collective voices. Jada says, where the people have the choice. Ralph says, the freedom to have a voice. Nicole says the difference between equality and equity in politics. Right? So there's a lot in there, right? I mean, that's some rich stuff. Cynthia, what would you add to those definitions? How would you take a crack at the word democracy?
Well, I think democracy is a promise for the way people can live their lives the way they want to.
A promise.
So, a promise.
To live your life the way you want to.
Yep.
Think about all of those words, and that's some rich stuff. And thank you each for sharing your thoughts in there. Brianna, you're just joining us. Thank you for coming in. We're sharing our own definitions of the word democracy inside the chat. So if you want to, just hop in the chat there and share your own definition of democracy. There's no wrong answer or anything. Simone says she likes the Nicole's definition, the CCE Ed Pathways definition. That's Nicole. So all of these are awesome. And they also begin to open this door into this conversation. Democracy deficit disorder. That's a loaded phrase. But what we know is that in schools, democracy is not mock elections. Hello, welcome, Tracy. Drop your definition of democracy into the chat, please. There's no wrong answer. Just put something in there. You can scroll up if you want to see other definitions. Brianna, make sure you get yours in there. In schools, democracy is not an adult-controlled newspaper made by students. Democracy is not the school board photo ops. Democracy is not any one of those things. It's not democracy for, with, or by students. And that's what this slide means. Simone says, even though I said democracy is freedom, freedom does come with limits, as you need to set a structure so that everyone can be free in a healthy and lawful way. Even the notion of laws, that gets into a whole democratic piece and what that means. In order to really understand what the disorder is, though, to our democracy, we have to understand what the democracy is in the first place. You know, what's the starting point? So what Cynthia and I learned in our study that made our book, the subheading here is learning democracy with young people. And since this presentation is focused on schools itself, we can really begin to see, oh, wait a second, we have a cauldron, we have a pot, we have a big space where people can learn democracy. But it doesn't happen by accident. There's a lot of intention, there's a lot of design that can go array. And frankly, what we've discovered over the last 50, 60, 70 years is that democracy's been going array for a hot minute. This isn't new since 2014. This isn't new since 2000. Tracy says democracy is decisions made by the people. And of course, we have that old idea of by the people, for the people, straight from our founding documents in the United States. Welcome, Elvia. Welcome, Maria. Welcome, Michael. I want to invite you all to drop your own definitions of democracy into the chat. Brianna, I'm still looking for yours if you can get to it. But the point here is we have this as a foundation, these different definitions that are coming through. But then we have the question of a disorder and the deficit. What do those things mean? What does it look like when schools are missing democracy? So here we've said what democracy is. But the next part that I want us to think about, and maybe we can do this one out loud. Brianna says democracy is all about equality, freedom, and diversity. One of the things that we could think about out loud is what is missing from schools' democracy. Some people just say, well, democracy is just missing from schools, period. But that's too easy of an answer. So what I want to challenge you to do right now, if you have a strong voice, if you feel that you want to share, is unmute yourself. Tell me what's missing in school democracy right now. Anybody at all. Just unmute yourself and speak right up, please.
Student voice.
What does student voice mean, Nicole? That's an easy answer.
Students' perspective in their own education. A lot of times you go to school and you just do what your teacher says, but it's not so often that students get the input of what their school day consists of.
Perfect. I love that. This notion that every student has a voice and we need to make space is absolutely missing. Brianna?
I would say diversity. Like, I feel like that's the big thing that missing in schools. Like, I work with students that is like first and second grade as elementary, and I've noticed that they're only like one race, and they're not like a lot of race. And I feel like that you're not gonna learn no culture, new background. And it's like you just when you go, it's not gonna help the student when they go to a job one day and you see all this other people that is like cultures. It's not gonna help them. They're gonna be like, they're gonna feel overwhelmed and like, oh my God, it's not gonna be good. So I think that we are missing diversity.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And that diversity is in so many ways. You mentioned race specifically. We have all kinds of different diversities. We have our diversity of perspectives. We have our diversity of politics or socioeconomic classes. We have our unseen diversities in terms of neurodiversity, in terms of our trauma-informed histories. All of these things play into that diversity question. Simone, I see your hand. Thank you for using that. What do you think? What's missing from democracy in schools?
So definitely, like I said in the chat, and someone else said the first time, that freedom of speech by the students, even though they're children, it doesn't mean that they don't know what's going on. They don't have an opinion. And also to comment on the freedom, the diversity, we've done a lot of redlining with the schools, not letting children and their parents enroll in a quote unquote better school that's in a different zip code.
Yep. Thank you, Simone.
Most families have to do it kind of illegally, you
Yeah.
know, by like enrolling with a family member that's in that zip code so they can go to a better school. But without everyone having the freedom to go to whatever school they want, it's not going to be diverse because it's going to be the kids that live in the area.
That's right. That's right. And the redlining in schools echoes the redlining in neighborhoods.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
right.
Thank you, Simone. I
Right.
appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right. So, and Elvia says there in the chat, diversity of voices. So we think about democracy in the ways that we've defined it. We think about what the deficit is in terms of what's missing from democracy in schools. And then we think about the disorder. And the disorder, just as a simple analogy, let's take our puzzle box, right? And you take that lid off and you throw it onto the table and you have 1,000 puzzle pieces in front of you. My co-author Cynthia likes to do puzzles, so I'm trying to appeal to her. But the idea is that's the disorder. That's the melee that has become democracy in schools, because it's a hit and miss. You'll have one school that is entirely on fire for democracy, and it could be an elementary education school where it's just happening in K through 5. But then you can go to a middle school and get another great democratic experience. But more challenging, and part of that disorder is that those are big paintbrush swaths. In reality, you get it in this classroom and you get none in the next 20 classrooms, or you get it in this one activity and you get none for the rest of the day. And that disorder is all over the place. It's a muck, because not only is that happening on a classroom by classroom basis, building by building basis, district by district basis, state by state basis, it's also happening on a teacher by teacher, student by student basis, where some students get more democracy than others. And so it becomes a tricky thing. If you look like Adam, I identify as a white male. And if you look like this, you get a lot of democracy in some places. In other places, other people have more democracy. But that's the disorder of it all. That's the chaos. So that's the democracy deficit disorder, and why we conceived of it that way. Cynthia, do you have any thoughts you want to throw into that?
I was just going to raise my hand, Anna, because I think as a female in the classroom, much of the disorder that I experienced in all the years I taught, and I just finished 52 years of doing that, was I didn't get a chance to have my voice heard. I knew that my colleagues didn't have a chance to get their voice heard. That, in fact, not only don't kids have their voice, but oftentimes as teachers, we don't, particularly as female teachers. And I think that's the other piece of the lack of democracy, the disorder sort of rolling up the hill from the kids to the teachers to the adults. And then we can say that maybe parents don't have a lot to say that's productive about how they think their children should be educated, how they can participate. And I think that's another piece of it. I think it affects all of us professionally in so many different ways. And when you talk about going from the classroom to the neighborhood, to the school district, to the state Department of Education, to the National Department of Education, you know, these are conversations that are not being held any place, not being held any place. All we care about are test scores. And
So
that really, go ahead.
That we're here today having this conversation is the beginning of dismantling the disorder.
Exactly. Exactly. We have to be talking about it so that we understand how to bring it back to some level of success. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Cynthia. And thanks again to you all for jumping into the chat. Make sure that you're flipping through the chat if you're not. There's some really
Right.
interesting, good comments. On this slide, we see the democracy deficit disorder is represented in 3 ways. They're on the right: thoughts, feelings, actions. This is a really simple breakdown. It's a really simple way to see it. We enact democracy in our thoughts, in the way that we process the world. We enact our democracy in our feelings and emotions. Believe it or not, democracy is apparent in our feelings. And then finally, we enact democracy in our action. And as educators, we are constantly ferreting out, how do we think? How do we feel? What do we do? And then we do that from this global perspective. And we do it from a country perspective. And we do it from a community perspective. And then we do it from our individual perspective. And those might vary according to our perspective, where our position in the classroom at any given point in the day, because in some classrooms, we're autocrats and we jump up there and we have a totalitarian regime that's going to follow our order no matter what. And then in other classrooms, we are very democratic. We're wide-hearted, we're open-minded, and we're just going to embrace the process of teaching and learning as it comes, and democracy is going to become apparent. So we have to think in our classrooms, what does this actually look like? But then I had to get nerdy. And we have this issue of, and one of the things that Cynthia and I spend some time in our book exploring is, where do students learn democracy?
Yeah.
Where are they at it? So here we have a graphic that I messed up apparently on the slideshow. At the top of the triangle is the word school. That's one place where students learn democracy. In the bottom right hand, starting with B, is the word business. And business is a catch-all, right? It means every kind of profit-making scheme, whether that's on a student's cell phone, whether that's on our laptop, on our browser, whether that's out in the neighborhood going to stores, whether that's going to the mall and going to the big box, all these different kinds of businesses. And then the bottom left-hand corner, where do students learn democracy, is home, and that question of home. So we have this notion of, where do students learn democracy? But then we have these balances in between. We have the public, the private, and the other. And the point of democracy varies according to the person. It seems to right now, at least that's what the media keeps telling me. So that some people, democracy works to make them very wealthy. And for other people, democracy works to make them very complacent. So what is democracy doing at any point? Is it public? Is it private? Or does it have some other purpose? What do you all think about where democracy is learned? Go ahead and drop into the chat just any word that comes to your mind. Where is democracy learned? So here we have school, home, and business. Get as specific as you want, be as vague as you want. Where is democracy learned by students? On the playground, watching parents vote, at home, in the community, at home. If everybody drops something into that chat, we're going to have a beautiful long list. Sibling relationships. In the classroom, it's taught. What else do we got? Sylvia, Stephanie, Ellie, Heather, Anahit, Edom, I'm glad that you all joined us. Thank you. From home and then in the classroom. I think it's a combination of all three, but not always equal contributors. That's right, it's not balanced. I don't remember the name of the triangle that's all askew, but it would definitely be one or the other. It's an interesting thing watching 3- and 4-year-olds play and their innate notion towards fairness. And if you equate fairness to democracy, you could argue that a young child has some notion of democracy. Anahit says it's a combination. Simone says it's harder to see democracy shown publicly. Anahit says homeschool and community. I think the idea of businesses teaching democracy is a scary thing. I think about the video games that I've seen young people interact with and play with. And those are just simply tools for somebody to make a lot of money, but they teach democracy. Insofar as if you're working in a group setting in a game, we all have to make this decision whether we're on headphones or using Discord or just rolling together. And then all of a sudden we got to make a decision. How does it happen? And do we rely on democracy? Do we rely on that autocratic leader who's like, let's all go this way? And so all of these forces are constantly working for and against democracy simultaneously. The question becomes less of where do students learn democracy, but it becomes more of who do we want them, where do we want them to learn democracy, I think. Any thoughts or responses to that idea of where democracy is and happens? Where do students learn it? Anybody at all? Just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak up.
I believe they definitely learn at home first. When there's a 2-parent household or 2 siblings, they learn it between their parents. They learn it between themselves, who's gonna play the video game first, who's gonna, get the bigger piece first. And then but that's just the basic level. Then they go to school, it can put the words and science behind it
That's great,
and
Simone.
play it
Thank
out
you.
with more students and adults as well, and build their democracy confidence up.
Yeah. Cynthia says there in the chat, family matters a great deal. Cynthia, do you want to ask your prompt there?
Yeah, so when we're thinking about where we see democracy, I've been watching C-SPAN a great deal to get a better sense of what the legislature is attempting to do. And so I'm wondering if my sense of democracy has anything to do with that public arena, of watching how decision-making is made well or made not so well, and understanding that basic structural process that created what we call a democracy in the country. So I'm wondering if other people can get a sense of democracy by watching that process, watching a school board meeting, watching, the legislative aspects of the country, when it works and when it doesn't work, and how we can be critical of it and how we can watch it. Not so much the news, but actually, yes, I agree. Simone, C-SPAN can be a bit boring, but I've learned a lot by watching, like I watched a hearing the other day about the Veterans Administration with the director of the Veterans Administration. I was so impressed with him, and I felt so hopeful after I listened to him because he made so much sense and he really answered all the questions. And that to me was democracy in action in a way that I don't get to see that on a day-to-day basis. So I wonder how other people feel about that external view of democracy as well. And how can we help young people think about that in a different way? So yeah, we should be going to school board meetings, absolutely, and city council meetings.
And
Yep.
neighborhood associations and these more democratic spaces where we have more room. I also want to hear more ideas. Let me say really quick though, Cynthia, what you bring to mind is the role of the teacher in relationship to C-SPAN.
Absolutely.
It's one thing to watch C-SPAN. It's another thing to have a facilitated experience where you can discern the meaning and the purpose and the process and everything you're seeing. Otherwise, it can look like a pile of boring old white men in suits. And to whose advantage is that on any given basis? It comes down to who the teacher is of that learning at that point. Other thoughts, other places where you see where students learning democracy or just opinions in general. Just unmute yourself and speak up or drop your comment into the chat. I'm going to flip to the next slide in just a minute unless anybody pipes up.
I think children also see democracy when they're in clubs and sports, because there's literally a winner and a loser, but at the end of the day, it's all, no matter who wins or lose, it's for the group.
It's for the greater benefit. I love that, Simone. And that's a great observation about the role of extracurriculars and out of school time as well. And this whole notion that what we don't see in the classroom, we can still ascertain and get the benefit of in the larger community beyond the local classroom. Thank you. Any other thoughts about locations? Cool, let's keep rolling. This workshop is going to go very fast. The dilemma, of course, there are so many dilemmas of the democracy deficit disorder. But basically what I did right here on this slide was just try to boil down about 20 pages of research citations to really show, all right, here it is. Pacification, oversimplification, infantilization, docility, compliance, complicity, and perpetuation, specifically of the negative aspects of our society. These are research proven outcomes of this disorder. When our democracy starts to erode in such a way that it snowballs, that it avalanches in our schools, we have real outcomes. You all have different amounts of experience. Some of you are really educated in terms of your background. Some of you are very experienced in terms of teaching and learning. Some of us are parents. Lots of these different ways that we see this. I would love to hear some of your thoughts about these words. And this question that about the infantilization of way of the democracy deficit disorder in schools. I'll start with that one, but I would love to hear any of you speak to these or anything else that comes to your mind in terms of the results of the democracy deficit disorder. Infantilization is this notion that we are teaching down to children below children's ability. We have this notion right now, because of the past 20 years of ed reform, we have this notion that every child has this capability, this capacity to learn and be learned to a certain amount that we can measure and discern because of our tests and our different abilities in schools to do that. And the dilemma of it is that we have brought a lot of these demands 20 years ago at the beginning of No Child Left Behind specifically. We used to talk about rigor. And we used to talk about this notion of teaching up so that students would develop their capability beyond our expectations. To this point, though, today, a lot of schools are simply focused on the lowest common denominator as represented by testing. And so we teach to the amount of test and then we stop. So that infantilizes the intellectual mind of the student. But we've also infantilized the democratic mind of kids, so that our third graders don't know, understand, or believe in the power of elections because we don't let them actually have it. Instead, we give them two choices and say, you can either go outside during recess and then come back in and do your homework, or we can just work through recess so you don't have to do the homework later. And in that way, we infantilize their democratic expectation. If we take the lid off of that and allow them to do what is developmentally appropriate, age appropriate even, we would ask them more open-ended questions. We would give them more real possibilities rather than close-ended, unreal. That's not decision-making. Alfie Cohen was a great writer to point out the reality that when we let students lead, we can actually have real results that result in democracy. Unfortunately, we're not letting them do that. And because of that, we're having this infantilization happen all the time. Simone, you have your hand up?
Yes, so in my class, we were talking about infantilization, oversimplification, how, like I said earlier, children understand way more than we think. And when we oversimplify, when we give them only a few choices, or we say, hey, what color is this? When they already went through that maybe 2 weeks ago and they remember, that children tend to gravitate to the older kids.
That's right.
If, you know, the older kids are playing a game and the younger kids they're having the younger kids go get stuff. And they go, hey, you got the wrong thing, stupid. Go put that back.
That's right.
And they're thinking, well, man, that hurt, but at least they're being honest. At least they're treating me like a person.
Yep. And this
rather
is
than
democracy, right? It's this.
oversimplify.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt there, Simone.
That's okay. What were you gonna say?
Just that democracy is sloppy. You know, there are times when it doesn't look as linear as we want it to. It's
Mhm.
not necessarily A, B, C. Sometimes it's A, B, Y, or it's A, Y, Z, or it's not even sequential.
Yes.
It's A7M, you know, and it takes on these
Mhm.
different forms and does these different things. That's a great, I love that illustration that you gave us. Thank you, Simone.
Thank you. And then what do you mean by pacification and docility in the
Yeah.
context of
Yeah,
this?
that's a great question. Pacification is this notion that we can pacify or make somebody less assertive, aggressive, forward than they are innately or inherently. So by taking away agitation, by removing all the sharp edges, we create a safe space for everybody to interact. The dilemma of pacification is that it also takes away a lot of motivation and, frankly, inner drive that's required to be a successful learner. Cynthia, do you have more thoughts about pacification or docility or any of the rest of the list?
So I think the best thing that happens in classrooms where teachers try to move toward a democracy environment is to assume children have value and comment and perspective, and to back off from understanding that they should be the person that tells them. So the best classrooms, the classrooms that lead young people to find themselves and their thinking, is to be in a place where you're providing questions and asking young people to ask the questions. So if someone is asking a difficult question and I don't really want to answer it, then I can pacify them by giving them a simple, milk toasty kind of response and not delve into anything that's deeper. And so that sort of pacifies that innate curiosity from a child by just like dismissing it. It's the same thing with oversimplification. and docility. The easiest classroom to manage is the one where everybody's quiet, well-behaved, silent, and following directions. That's the easiest classroom to manage. Hard sometimes to get there, but that's the easiest. That's the model that we think is the easiest classroom. That's not a democratic classroom.
We need
That's,
to, oh,
go ahead, go.
just, we need to keep moving in our slides, Simone. Can you drop your comment into the chat for me, please? And for the rest of the folks here, if you have other thoughts about this list specifically, drop it in the chat. Let's keep that conversation going there, and we could try to do two at once. I wanted to share this quote because I think it's very relevant and important to this conversation. First, they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak up. You've read this before. I didn't speak up because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. That was said by Martin, that was written by Martin Mueller, a Lutheran minister in Germany, who ended up reflecting on his time in Germany after the war. And this is one of the pieces that came out from his writing. I think it's really relevant to this conversation of democracy in schools, because some of us, people who enjoy schools oftentimes become teachers. People who are successful at schools
Yeah, it's
become
true.
teachers.
It's true.
So if we think of the school version of this quote, is it something to the effect of, first, they didn't practice democracy with the neurodiverse, but I didn't speak out because I wasn't neurodiverse. Then they didn't practice democracy with students of color and I didn't speak out because I'm not a student of color. And then they didn't practice democracy with middle schoolers and I didn't speak out because I'm not a middle schooler. You know, does it go on like that? You can fill in those blanks, because we suddenly have a way to see democracy in its urgency, because it affects all of us. Because at the end, without democracy, what's there? So we have to think of what democracy does. And towards that end, in the book, I explain this democracy action spiral. Now you can see in this model, there are 4 different avenues for democracy. The first avenue is the democratic participation. This is our lowest common denominator. Raise your hand if you think that we should go outside. Great, we're going to go outside. The majority spoke. As we go up the spiral, we can see the democratic voice. And the democratic voice is the young person who's actually empowered to be able to say what they have on their mind. We talked about student voice earlier. Then we have democratic involvement. And this might include representation. This might include voluntary engagement. But then we go up the spiral one more step and we have democratic engagement itself. So the difference between involvement and engagement. Finally, we have democratic infusion, where the entire learning experience is completely infused with democracy through and through. And you can see the bar on the right represents this notion of empowerment, partnerships, and equity raising throughout that action spiral. So I want you all to think about your own learning experiences, whether you're a teacher, whether you've been a student for a long time, no matter what your role is. And in the chat, tell me, what does democratic participation look like? Just participation, showing up. I'm going to write the word voting. Anybody else, type it into the chat. What does democratic participation look like? There's no wrong answers. Don't be shy. Jada says having conversations. Thank you. Cynthia says volunteering. Simone says participation equals speaking up. And Ralph says speaking out during discussions, because then we get up this spiral a little bit and we see democratic voice. So what does democratic voice look like in schools? If we're to illustrate that, what does that actually look like? Sharing your voice, sharing your perspective as a student. What does that do? What does that look like? Heather says choice. Choice equals voice is a popular phrase. Listening. Ironically, democratic voice equals listening. It's not just about sharing it. It's also about taking it in. Simone says, because when you speak up on a problem, you encourage higher participation because most likely other students have had the same problem. Other thoughts? All right, so the next question to respond to in the chat, what does democratic involvement look like? So here's where action begins. You can really see it physically. What does democratic involvement look like in schools? Cynthia says this is hard. This is a tough one. Any thoughts from anybody? There's no wrong answer here. When we think about involvement, when we think about students actually enacting democracy, what does that look like? Heather says encouraging others to vote or running for office. Jada says student councils. Not maybe, Jada, definitely. Student councils are democratic involvement, or they can be. Elvia says students articulating their thoughts. Simone says clubs that are student-led. Ooh, now Simone, you scooted us another step up the spiral, because next we have the question of democratic engagement. First thing though, let's take a little pause. We're all, you all know what these words are. They have different meanings. Let's see if we can figure this out. What's the difference between involvement and engagement? Anybody want to unmute themselves and just share that out loud? What's the difference between involvement and engagement? Ooh, Simone says she's not sure about this one. So involvement, we have words all over this spiral. Participation is simply showing up. Involvement is starting to do something. Engagement is that choice that you make to do it over and over. So you can be involved for a day. You can be engaged for an hour. I'm sorry. You can participate for a day. You can be involved for a quarter or a semester. You can be engaged for your lifetime. You can also be involved for your lifetime and never become engaged, because you don't choose to do it over and over. You just kind of show up. You're just kind of participating, right? You're doing it. So the difference between democratic involvement and democratic engagement, democratic involvement, you vote in the student council election because that's what our whole school is doing today. Democratic engagement, you start to feel it, right? And you feel it in all these different ways. So does anybody have any thoughts about democratic engagement in schools?
Some of the most interesting democratic engagement activities occur in places where young people decide to come together and create change, right? So we've all heard these stories about, there's an issue on the playground, and the young people, the kids decide it's not safe on the playground. We have to figure out something to do. And they come up with a plan. They take it to the principal. They try and work it out. They get a little bit of what they want. They don't get everything they want, and they move forward. So essentially, creating petitions. And I remember this is a funny little story. I was teaching in Compton. The kids in Compton had been given free cheese, and we decided that we would test to determine whether or not it was really cheese or not. And it wasn't really cheese. I don't know what it was. And so my class sort of went on strike and refused to eat the cheese that they were getting until they got real cheese. That created a real huge challenge for the administration. They didn't want to deal with that. But that was absolute engagement, where they decided, it wasn't me, they decided, what are we eating? What is this stuff? What is this stuff that families have been given? This orangey looking stuff that doesn't melt. What should we do about that? And that's engagement at a whole nother level of putting your feet and your mouth and your hands together to create change.
And Cynthia, that's an awesome example. Thank you for that. I want to share specifically at Davis Middle School in Compton. There's a wonderful tech teacher. His name is Jose Gonzalez. And for the last decade, Jose's been doing tech immersive teaching with his middle school students in Compton Unified. And it became a fantastic thing where about 5 or 6 years ago, he began having these students who were so tech immersed and tech inclined, he had them teach other students how to use the technology. And suddenly these students shifted from, this is just a class that I'm in, to suddenly they're living and breathing technology and technology education. But then the weirdest part came to Jose's class when teachers started to ask, how can we learn about what you're doing? And so Jose had students teach teachers how to use the technology in the class.
I love it. I
And that's
love it.
democratic engagement at one of its thickest, just like you're illustrating. So we have lots of these great examples and different ways to see these words. I don't want to hang around on this graphic too long, but for the sake of taking a look, different ways to engage in democracy. On the far left, we have a simple process of benefiting. We benefit from democracy, and we all do, whether or not we acknowledge it. Same with our students. They actually benefit from democracy, whether that's the school bond levy that passed, whether that's the school board members that their parents voted for, whatever that lever is, they benefit from democracy. Then they participate in democracy. We use the word engage, drive and lead, critically examine. Imagine your students critically examine democracy in schools. What would that look like? What would that do? Then we get liberatory, and then we have transformative democracy. And that's where we actually take steps to change democracy. The Arab Spring from about a decade ago now was actually led by young people who were stepping out through technology to lead that transformation of their society. This is fighting the democracy deficit disorder. But another way to fight the democracy deficit disorder that Cynthia and I learned about in our process of writing our book was this notion of acknowledging the whole student. So that rather than seeing the learner as just one person in one seat during one class at one time during the day, which is very real, we get to acknowledge that there is more to the whole student, and that by acknowledging the whole student, we can begin towards moving against this democracy deficit. Because what the deficit does is squeezes out that individuality. It squeezes out those identities, and it begins to isolate the student as just a learner, just a student, rather than a member of a democratic society who can benefit, change, and transform it at will. So look over this list of the whole student. All of these different aspects: home, school, friends' house, work, internet, gaming, texting, neighborhood, sports, social media, faith community, volunteering, the social aspects, the emotional, the cultural aspects, the gender identity, economic, educational, spiritual, nutritional, environmental, physical, cognitive. So many parts to the whole student. What do we do with them? Simone says that would be a game changer if students were allowed to critically examine democracy. Well, let's talk about this game changer. If you were to see, and let me ask you all this right now, do you see these parts of your students in your classrooms on the regular? Do you have any activities that you specifically do that draw out the whole student? Or do you see your students as individual or as parts of the machine? They're just in this class right now, no matter what. So do you see any of these parts? Simone asks, what do we do with this many aspects? And then answers, we embrace them, we talk about them. Is there anything that you do in your classroom right now, any of you? Says, go ahead.
Yes, so I was saying usually because that's how it normally is. But what I'll say not in my classroom, but in my student club, we're working on talking about social media and the effects of it, how our culture and our families shape how we become as students.
Yep.
And then in my classroom, we talk about cognitive and physical, nutritional, environmental things that make up the child's brain and the child's sense of self.
Awesome. Very cool. Thank you, Simone. Anybody else? Any other places in your classroom or otherwise? Heather says these aspects are often part of community building each day to build connections and empathy. Oh, Heather, I would love to hear about how that community building happens. I'm glad to hear that there are aspects of this that show up. Anybody else? Do you have more ways that you acknowledge these different parts of the whole student in your classrooms?
So I only like volunteering at this school, so I'm not an actual teacher. But what I noticed that for the school, I mean for the classes I observe and help out, I noticed that the only thing I could say that I'm really focused on is like the social, the culture, and like honestly, like when it comes to like also like when it comes to social, like technology, like it's a lot that in the school that they need to improve of when it comes to like you know, budgeting, like, no, when it comes to like using the budget of the money, because they rather use it for computers and iPads, and instead of opening up the library and having the librarian had to lose their job. It's like, what are you gonna teach his kids? Like, it's our world gonna be like all technology now? Like, there are no more libraries. That's not really fun for anybody, you know. So I mean, we learn about, that's why I've been like, you know, noticing learning in the classroom when I observe, and I noticed that they never come to the library. And I know because I be going to the program and they all in the playground and just talking and doing stuff, but they never go to the library. I never see nobody said interested in going to the library. And it's really sad because, you know, it's just, they rather just act like, you know, they act like it never there, like it never exists in the first place. So it's like, that's so really sad. And yeah, they think it's like, and I think that we need to like figure out like how to like make this better, because we have a lot to do with to make education better.
Thank you, Brianna. I appreciate that. It says over in the chat, working together in small groups to share and embrace our similarities and differences to build our community, and having hands-on activities, including using their devices and technology. I appreciate that. Cynthia says reading is so critical to learning different points of views. So all of this notion that we have these whole people in our rooms brings to mind then, how come this isn't happening? Well, we have a long list here, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to let you take a minute to do that. But the idea is that behind this holistic learning and teaching, there are some core beliefs that we can begin to grok, that we can begin to put together for ourselves. The first one is that all students and adults have inherent value. That on its own begins to defeat the democracy deficit disorder, because it replaces within each person the value of them. Depending on how you enact it, then we can also see the last bullet point: holistic learning and teaching is the most important transformation schools can make today, because we begin to understand that we can move past that individuation and start to get towards this collective and whole perspective. Here we have some locations for holistic learning and teaching. Again, this is what leads us into the defeating the democracy deficit disorder. Belonging is at the core of these locations. Support from friends in the larger community, learning opportunities, access to resources, opportunities to generate, contribute, and consolidate resources, safe and comfortable housing, full democratic engagement. We begin to see the real potentials for these locations. But then in the individual school, we suddenly begin to pull out these ways that the democracy deficit disorder is defeated with this holistic learning and teaching. Everyday care and help, personal safety, all the way down to understanding family backgrounds and full democratic engagement. So this doesn't just happen on a big world global level. It doesn't just happen on the building level. It also happens on the individual level. And you can see that some of these are repeating from our previous slides. So we suddenly have this place where all of these different perspectives come to a head. But then we get this Piaget quote, where she states very clearly that the principal goal of education in the schools should be to create people who are capable of doing new things, not simply repeating what other generations have done. People who are creative, inventive, and discoverers, who can be critical and verify and not accept everything they're offered. What would this look like in your classroom? What would this look like in your school, in your building, in your district? So let's put that question out there and just ask this in general. What does defeating the democracy deficit disorder look like in your school, in your location, wherever you're at? Piaget kind of breaks it down right here. Simone says, I believe it should be required on all levels of learning. Me too. Other thoughts?
Me three.
Yeah. What does defeating the democracy deficit disorder look like in your school? Anybody at all, jump into the chat or unmute yourself. Share your thoughts. Cynthia, please, Simone, go ahead.
So I believe defeating it is, allowing the students to relax. Because again, they're not cogs in the machine. They don't have to be um, working in the classroom all day. I also think that it should be very much more focused on their emotional state and not just social, because obviously you're going to be social if you're in a group full of your peers.
Right.
But it should definitely be, focused on how they're feeling, what they would like to do, um, and not just about what the teacher wants, because the teacher is an adult. They have their own say. They have their own things. They don't have to answer to their parents anymore. So the students should at least have some type of freedom in the school.
Thank you, Simone. I appreciate that. Check this out, everybody. I made a slide to help us think about these different places. Now, here I talk about meaningful student involvement, but the long story short is this is another avenue for defeating the democracy deficit disorder. There's a lot of talk in schools some days about student voice and about student leadership and student empowerment. The problem is that those activities often get very selective. When, Simone, your idea and what you shared, that's for every student. Here in the chat, Heather says it includes having all stakeholders participate in the decision-making for the process of allocating funds, classes available to select from, and other priorities that schools focus on. And Heather, that actually begins to get to this notion of meaningful student involvement, more than just student voice, more than just bringing in any one type of learning process. Meaningful student involvement can happen everywhere for every student all of the time. So we have all these different locations where we can begin to fight the democracy deficit disorder. In my research, I found that there's one simple cycle that we can begin to follow in order to break this down and get to it. And I wanted to share that before we are done with our workshop today. It's this simple cycle. I call it the cycle of student engagement. And it's simply learning to listen to students. But that's not all. It's learning to listen to students and then validating them, acknowledging what they're saying. But that's not all. It's authorizing them to take action and do something different. That could be through a formal position, an informal position, some kind of a project, some kind of outcome that you're looking for, but giving them the authority, the ability to tell their own story. And then you'll see next on the cycle, the ability to act and do with this knowledge that they've gained. When they're done acting, they can reflect on it, and we can use that reflection to listen again. Because it's a cycle, because this work of defeating the democracy deficit disorder is never over. Simone?
I was going to put in the chat, but this circle reminds me of what therapists do with their clients. Therapists listen to their client stories, they validate their emotions, they authorize on what they believe they should maybe do instead. And then with the therapist, the client then acts and reflects, and then all over again.
I'm glad
And
that you see that,
same way,
Simone.
teachers should be like therapists and not just authoritatives.
That's right. That's exactly it. And when I first published this specific tool 20 years ago, there were a lot of people who didn't understand that notion of implementing it across spaces. So this is great in the classroom, but it can also work at home. It can also work in therapy. It can also work in a lot of different places. And that's the notion of the democracy deficit disorder, that we can work with every one of our spaces to overcome this deficit. Here we have a big mess of different activities, literal classroom strategies to end the democracy deficit disorder. I'm not going to peel over them all at once, but if you want to learn more about it, you'll check out freechild.org, and you can find more information on ending the democracy deficit disorder there. You'll also want to check out Cynthia and I's book. Oh, wait, Alfie Cohen. Here he is. 1993. So 30 years ago now. Alfie wrote, "Children, after all, are not just adults in the making. They are people whose current needs and rights and experiences must be taken seriously." Now, though, 30 years on, we know why that's the case. Because when young people are neglected, when young people are denied their rights, when their experiences aren't taken seriously, they tend to not stand for democracy. They tend to not stand for the thing that failed them. And we're going to see some very literal outcomes of that by the end. Again, this meaningful student involvement model gets messy really quick because there's so much going on in our schools that needs to be addressed. Our procedures, our policies, and practices all need to address the democracy deficit disorder. They can do that through meaningful involvement, but that can't be the only way. Our placement and our possibilities have to address the democracy deficit disorder. The things that we produce in schools, our products, our places, our personnel, all of these things matter. But then we can break it down in a very simple way by looking at these 9 different quadrants. I guess 9 isn't quadrants, 9 different boxes that talk about what system-wide meaningful student involvement looks like. So here we are at the end of this time. Simone asks, is the meaningful student involvement web in the book? The answer is no, Simone. However, there is a lot of information about meaningful student involvement in the book as a strategy, and I have a lot more material available about that as well. So let's just open the floor, and we have a few more minutes left. Questions, comments, ideas about the democracy deficit disorder? What we've learned today and what we've talked about is that it happens in so many places. The disorder does. It happens in so many ways, but that there are so many avenues that we can begin to defeat the disorder and rebuild what our schools are and what they do. Let's take a question from Simone. What do you got?
I wanted to know, is this session going to be viewable later since it's being recorded?
I presume that it is. We can find out from Nicole and let you know.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
Oh,
Ryan.
and then where can we purchase you guys' book?
It's on Amazon and lots of the online sellers that you normally go to.
So
Tracy,
I don't, oh,
Thank you for
sorry.
the clap, Tracy. I saw that. Go ahead,
So
Cynthia.
I don't want to end the session without reminding everybody that teachers need to have all that respect that we talked about for kids as well. Because you can't comfortably do a democratic classroom if you're not feeling empowered yourself. So the question is, how do you talk with your administration and your colleagues about how to garner that respect for everybody in the building? And that's a really important and difficult thing to do, to create a safe environment for everybody to have those conversations. And so we have to be treated well so we can treat our kids well. So
And to add to that, Cynthia, to also say that the change actually begins in your classroom. No matter what your job is,
that's right.
whether you're a para or a teacher or a building administrator or and on, you can begin to defeat the democracy deficit disorder right now by changing your own immediate locus of control, you know, what you can do. So don't let that overwhelming, daunting aspect of everybody all the time keep you from taking action.
Yeah, you can just take one little step. You know, one of them is, for me, the thing that changed my teaching practice was learning listening skills. You know, to be able to actively listen to myself and then my students so that I could generate an environment where students felt comfortable asking questions and I could hear them.
Yeah.
Like I could hear myself. What did I want? What kind of environment did I want? Rather than what I was told I wanted. And that was really important. One book that I love that was very helpful for me was everything from Tom Gordon and Teacher Effectiveness Training. It's a very excellent book to teach about listening and getting your listening skills up. So
And
probably
when
go ahead.
you get your copy of Democracy Deficit Disorder, you'll see a bunch of resources in the back
That's right.
that include that and a lot more.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's 11:59 right now, so let's go ahead and close this. I do want to remind you all that there is a workshop on adultism in schools this afternoon at 3 o'clock, and we would be glad to have you there as well. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you. You have a good day, you guys.
Thank you, Brianna.
Great to have all of you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, Sylvia. All right, Cynthia, I'm going to jump off of here. We'll talk.
Bye. You were great.
Woohoo, you too.